Coming to you from 4,200 feet in the hills of Oregon, it's the voice of Chi-Town, the reddest beard in the high desert, your host of the MOA Broadcast, Sam Wilson. All right, folks, we got a great show lined up for you today. As usual, we're going to go ahead and open up with a little bit of an intro here, kind of give you an idea. Today's topic of our true crime profile or story is going to be Anthony Gaspipe Casso. Now, as usual, so many of these stories and these men and their escapades, killers, criminals, men, women, whoever's involved, it's almost impossible to get everything dialed into and encapsulated in a 30 to 35 minute or so manuscript, which is what we do. In the beginning, I like to extemporize and talk freely, but whenever we actually get into the story, I try and go by manuscript. That way we can control everything, keep it in the time frame, and not wander off and go off on side quests and forget, potentially important, accurate, pertinent information. As usual, there's a lot of different names in foreign languages. Some of them I'm going to mispronounce, I'm sure. And there's also going to be details that are left out or that may not necessarily line up or agree with an account or a book that you've read. Sometimes that's unavoidable. Whenever doing research for these stories, I typically come across hundreds of pages. A lot of effort goes into the research on these. And I come across and read hundreds of pages, sometimes multiple books, and literally just all kinds of articles and so forth. Sometimes the information conflicts, sometimes it doesn't. At the end of the day, you have to go with a certain kind of, I hate to use the word narrative, but a path, and then kind of follow it. And there's also all kinds of information that's left out. There's just no way to cover every single thing these guys did unless we did multiple episodes. And we may do that in the future. I don't know. Some of these guys may get revisited and get a little more in depth. But for now, we're doing one episode at a time. And again, if some of these disagree with what you've heard, go ahead and hit us with an email at info@gearconvoy.com. And, give us your feedback. Let us know. We might be able to go back and add it to a future episode or make a correction or whatever else. And finally, don't forget to go to the website and hit the MOA Broadcast tab so you can get the latest in all the episodes. You can catch it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and a variety of other places, but you can also get the information directly at www.gearconvoy.com. Just click on that MOA tab at the top of the page, and that'll also tell you how to get the Patreon page if you want the video versions and all kinds of other stuff. Okay, let's go ahead and jump right into the story today. We've got a great one lined up, so we're going to get right to it. Here is the story of Anthony Gaspipe Casso. From Brooklyn streets to mafia boss, the bloody path to power and rise of Anthony Gaspipe Casso. Anthony Gaspipe Casso would become one of the most feared men in organized crime, a name whispered in both mob circles and law enforcement with equal dread. Known for his brutality, paranoia, and willingness to weaponize murder as a management tool, Casso rose to underboss of the Lucchese crime family during the height of New York's mafia power in the 1980s. But behind the image of a remorseless killer was a childhood molded by proximity to crime, a youth spent navigating the streets of South Brooklyn, and a calculated climb through the underworld that made him a uniquely dangerous figure. Born into the life. Anthony Salvatore Casso was born on May 21, 1942, in South Brooklyn, New York, a working-class neighborhood deeply entwined with the Italian-American mob. From an early age, crime was not only present in Casso's environment, it was in his blood. His father, Mike Casso, was a soldier in the Genovese crime family and worked on the Brooklyn waterfront, an area long dominated by organized crime. He was well respected and kept a low profile, but young Anthony grew up surrounded by men whose money, status, and power came from the shadows. Unlike some mobsters who stumbled into the life, Casso was born into it. He grew up idolizing gangsters who were treated like royalty in his neighborhood. They had flashy cars, money, respect, and above all, fear. Though his parents sent him to Catholic school and tried to offer a traditional upbringing, Casso's ambitions were already shaped by the streets. He dropped out of high school at 16, rejecting the legitimate world entirely. Nicknamed Gaspipe, a symbol of violence. Casso's nickname, Gaspipe, has murky origins. Some accounts suggest it was passed down from his father, while others believe it referred to the blunt, brutal tool commonly used in the beatings he was involved in, a fitting metaphor for his eventual methods. Regardless of its true meaning, the name would become synonymous with the violence and cold efficiency Casso later demonstrated. In his teenage years, Casso joined a local street crew under the Lucchese family's influence. His early jobs involved hijackings, burglaries, and loan sharking. But what set him apart was his cold-blooded nature. He wasn't just another tough kid. He was calculated, strategic, and unafraid to spill blood. This impressed Christopher "Christy Tick" Furnari, a high-ranking Lucchese capo who became Casso's mentor. Entry into the Lucchese family. Through Furnari, Casso gained entry into the inner workings of the Lucchese family. In the 1970s, he began working closely with Victor Amuzzo, another ambitious soldier. Together, the two formed a tight partnership that would define the future leadership of the family. Casso was officially made into the Lucchese family as a fully initiated member by the late 70s, during a time when the Mafia was at the height of its economic power. His loyalty and effectiveness in violent matters quickly earned him promotions. He was not merely a triggerman. He was also involved in sophisticated rackets, including construction extortion, loan sharking, narcotics, and the infamous gasoline tax scams, which generated millions in untaxed revenue for the Mafia. Mastermind and enforcer. Casso's talent for violence was matched by his understanding of power. He developed a reputation for ordering hits with frightening ease, not just against enemies, but sometimes against friends and allies he suspected of disloyalty. His strategic use of murder, combined with his insider relationships, helped him rise quickly within the family. In 1986, following a wave of leadership transitions in the Mafia, Victor Amuzzo became boss of the Lucchese family, and Casso was promoted to underboss, the second highest position. From that point forward, Casso was the operational architect of the family's criminal activity and its most feared enforcer. As underboss, Casso managed labor rackets, ordered hits, and coordinated with other Mafia families, but also ruled through terror. His paranoia grew over time, and he became notorious for preemptive violence, killing anyone he suspected of even minor betrayal. He even enlisted NYPD detectives Luis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa, later dubbed the Mafia Cops, to carry out hits and leak law enforcement information, solidifying his grip on power through a mix of corruption and coercion. A bloody path of murder to fuel his rise in the mob. Casso used murder not just as a tool, but as a central instrument of power. While he once claimed involvement in at least 36 murders, law enforcement officials have long suspected the true number may be much higher. His methods were brutal, his motivations often paranoid, and his reach extended all the way into the New York Police Department through a chilling alliance with two corrupt officers. The formative murders, establishing power. Casso's early murders were acts of loyalty and assertion, carried out during his rise through the Lucchese family. One of the first killings attributed to him was his alleged involvement in the 1983 assassination of Roy DeMeo, a prolific Gambino hitman whose own crew had become too volatile and visible. Ordered by Gambino boss Paul Castellano, the job was outsourced to Lucchese hitmen, possibly including Casso. The murder was both a favor and a warning. Evidence that Casso could be trusted with high-level mob executions. But Casso's most significant early use of murder came during the Mafia's internal chaos following John Gotti's unsanctioned 1985 hit on Castellano. In retaliation, the Lucchese and Genovese families orchestrated the 1986 car bombing of Gambino underboss Frank DeCicco, who had helped Gotti seize power. Casso played a central role in planning the attack with Sicilian mafia contacts. Though the bomb missed Gotti, it killed DeCicco, sending a lethal message about the consequences of violating mob protocol. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Casso's killing career was his use of NYPD detectives Luis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa to murder for him. Dubbed the Mafia Cops, these detectives leaked confidential law enforcement intelligence and even carried out hits themselves, all while in uniform. Here are a couple of the known murders they were involved in. We will cover them more in depth later on. In 1986, Casso survived an assassination attempt. Believing the attempt was orchestrated by a Gambino associate named James Heidel, Casso ordered Ippolito and Caracappa to find and eliminate him. The pair abducted Heidel and delivered him, alive, to Casso, who tortured him for hours before killing him. This marked the beginning of a long partnership. Casso paid the detectives thousands each month and used them as an extension of his violent will. Another murder carried out by the Mafia Cops was that of Eddie Lino, a Gambino capo suspected of being involved in the Casso hit. In 1990, the detectives pulled Lino over in a fake traffic stop and executed him on the Belt Parkway, with a precision that only trained officers could provide. Keeping it in the family. Murders of Lucchese insiders. As Casso rose to underboss in the late 80s under Vic Amuso, his paranoia intensified. Suspecting betrayal or even mild disloyalty, he began purging his own ranks. One notorious example was Bruno Facciolo, a Lucchese soldier accused of cooperating with law enforcement. In 1990, Casso ordered him killed. Facciolo was stabbed and shot multiple times, and his body was dumped in a car trunk, with a canary stuffed in his mouth, symbolizing a rat. The grotesque theatricality of the murder was meant to send a message, not just to potential informants, but to the entire family. Patrick Testa, another Lucchese associate, met a similar fate in 1992. He was suspected of disloyal behavior and shot dead in his own Brooklyn auto body shop, allegedly under Casso's direct order. By this point, loyalty was not enough. Unquestioning allegiance and fear were required. The Reznikov execution. Foreign threats meet mob justice. Not all of Casso's victims were mobsters. In one of the more high-profile cross-cultural murders, Casso ordered the 1986 execution of Vladimir Reznikov, a Russian mobster who tried to extort Lucchese-linked businessman Marat Balagula. Reznikov, unfamiliar with Casso's violent reputation, threatened his life during a shakedown. Casso retaliated swiftly. Reznikov was gunned down outside his home, a clear warning to other criminal groups not to encroach on mafia territory. Mass murder as management. Unlike other mobsters who killed reluctantly or under strict hierarchical orders, Casso made murder a routine tactic. He didn't just eliminate threats. He sent a message with each killing, reinforcing a reign of terror within and beyond the Lucchese family. By the late 80s, he was orchestrating murders not only to handle disputes, but to manipulate power, build alliances, and eliminate even minor risks. Casso's own words during his brief cooperation with the government in the mid-90s reflect this deadly pragmatism. He reportedly told FBI agents that murder was just business. His boast that he was involved in 36 murders was not a confession of guilt, but a claim to legacy, a resume of fear. Anthony Gaspipe Casso and the Mafia Cops, corruption, murder, and the NYPD's darkest alliance. In the brutal world of organized crime, few partnerships shock the public more than the covert alliance between Anthony Gaspipe Casso, underboss of the Lucchese crime family, and two veteran NYPD detectives, Stephen Caracappa and Louis Eppolito. Known as the Mafia Cops, these men were sworn to uphold the law, but instead they weaponized their badges, selling police intelligence and even participating in contract killings for Casso. This alliance marked an unprecedented fusion of law enforcement and mafia violence, and helped Casso eliminate rivals, settle vendettas, and instill fear within the ranks of New York's criminal underworld. The making of a deadly pact. In the mid-'80s, Anthony Casso had solidified himself as one of the most dangerous and cunning figures in the mafia. Ruthlessly loyal to Lucchese boss Vic Amuso, Casso oversaw a reign of terror that left dozens dead. But after surviving a 1986 assassination attempt, when gunmen fired at him while he was parked outside a Brooklyn social club, Casso's paranoia surged. He was determined to find those responsible, and his desperation led him to an unexpected source, the New York Police Department. Through intermediaries, Casso was introduced to detectives Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa, two decorated officers with deep ties to organized crime. Eppolito, notably, was the son and cousin of made men in the Gambino family. While Caracappa had worked in the NYPD's organized crime homicide unit, his proximity to mafia investigations only made him a more valuable asset. The pair agreed to provide confidential law enforcement information in exchange for regular cash payments, initially $4,000 a month, but later more when murders entered the arrangement. From intelligence to execution. At first, Casso used the detectives as a source of inside information. They leaked surveillance reports, wiretap updates, and arrest warrants, keeping the Lucchese hierarchy a step ahead of law enforcement. But the arrangement soon escalated into direct participation in murder. James Hidell. As mentioned earlier, in September 1986, Casso narrowly survived a mob hit outside his home in Brooklyn. Gunmen fired at him multiple times as he returned from a gym, wounding him in the back and neck. He barely escaped with his life. While recovering, Casso became obsessed with finding out who had ordered or carried out the attack. Through his street intelligence network and contacts, Casso identified James Hidell, a young associate of the Gambino crime family, as one of the shooters. Hidell was believed to be acting on orders from Eddie Lino, a Gambino capo and part of the powerful DeMeo crew. While there was never full confirmation that Hidell was the actual shooter, in Casso's mind, the connection was enough and justified a savage revenge. To exact revenge, Casso turned to two of his most dangerous and corrupt assets, the Mafia Cops. Casso instructed the detectives to locate Hidell and deliver him alive. They kidnapped Hidell off the street in broad daylight, using their police credentials to pull him into their car, an act made even more chilling by the fact that it mirrored a lawful arrest. Hidell was driven to a warehouse in Brooklyn controlled by the Lucchese family. What followed was one of the most grisly scenes in mafia history. Casso personally took charge of Hidell's interrogation. In the warehouse, he brutally tortured the young man for hours, demanding to know who had ordered the hit on him and who else had been involved. Hidell, possibly unaware of the details himself, either couldn't or wouldn't provide the names Casso wanted. In the end, Casso shot Hidell multiple times, estimates range from 10 to 15 times, in the limbs to extract the names of his accomplices. Once satisfied he had the information he wanted, he coldly shot him in the head, killing him. His body was never found, a classic mafia disappearance, meant to deny his family closure and avoid law enforcement attention. Eddie Leno. In 1990, Casso targeted Eddie Leno, a Gambino capo suspected of involvement in the earlier plot against him. This time, the Mafia Cops went further. They used their police cruiser to conduct a fake traffic stop on Leno along the Belt Parkway. When he pulled over, Caracappa and Ippolito executed him at point-blank range. It was a textbook mob hit, but with the authority and impunity of police officers. The benefits of a badge. Casso considered the Mafia Cops one of his most powerful weapons. With their help, he neutralized enemies both inside and outside the Lucchese family, and even eliminated perceived threats before they materialized. The detective's access to official police databases gave Casso the ability to track rival mobsters, potential informants, and law enforcement targets. In effect, he had converted a portion of the NYPD into his private intelligence and assassination agency. This alliance gave Casso a unique edge in the violent mob landscape of 1980s and early 90s New York. Other families could not compete with his level of inside access. Even more frightening, the detective's status within the NYPD allowed them to misdirect investigations and protect the Lucchese hierarchy from scrutiny. The end of the Mafia Cops. The partnership eventually crumbled in the early 90s as federal investigations intensified. After Casso's 1993 arrest, he agreed to cooperate with authorities, becoming one of the highest-ranking mobsters ever to turn informant. During debriefings, Casso disclosed the shocking truth. Two of New York's finest, who he referred to as his crystal ball, were on his payroll and had carried out multiple murders for the mob. The revelation set off one of the most controversial investigations in law enforcement history. Ippolito and Caracappa were eventually indicted in 2005 and convicted in 2006 on racketeering and multiple murder charges. Though they appealed their sentences, both were ultimately sentenced to life in prison. Ippolito died in custody in 2019. Caracappa died 2 years earlier. As for Casso, his cooperation was cut short when federal agents deemed him too deceptive and uncontrollable. He remained incarcerated for the rest of his life. Legacy: a deep stain on law and order. The Casso Mafia Cops alliance shattered public confidence in the institutions meant to protect society. It revealed how deep corruption could run and how fragile the boundary was between organized crime and lawful authority. Anthony Casso's use of police detectives to commit murder represented a new level of mafia brazenness, one that even the most storied mob bosses of the past had not dared to attempt. More than just a footnote in mob history, the partnership between Casso, Ippolito, and Caracappa serves as a cautionary tale. When greed, power, and betrayal converge, even the protectors of the law can become its most dangerous violators. The rise of the Russians. By the 1980s, Casso's control over rackets, influence over police, and strategic use of murder had made him one of the most powerful figures in the American mafia. Yet, as the traditional five families faced increasing law enforcement pressure and internal conflict, new criminal elements began to rise. Among them, the Russian mob, a decentralized but aggressive force expanding throughout New York's underworld. While the Italian mafia and Russian gangsters often operated in parallel, Casso's brief but violent confrontation with Russian mobsters exposed the shifting dynamics of organized crime in late 20th century America. The Russian challenge to mafia territory. By the mid-1980s, Brighton Beach in Brooklyn had become known as Little Odessa, home to a growing population of Soviet immigrants. With them came a sophisticated and ruthless network of criminals. Former KGB agents, black market traders, and prison-hardened gangsters. These Russian mobsters were unfamiliar with, and largely indifferent to, the deeply entrenched rules and hierarchies of La Cosa Nostra. They were brash, heavily armed, and less inclined to follow the Mafia's codes of respect and territorial deference. It was in this climate that Casso's path crossed with a powerful Russian gangster named Vladimir Reznikov. The Reznikov Incident: Disrespect and Retribution. A new breed of criminal had emerged from the immigrant neighborhoods of Brooklyn, the Russian mob, led by savvy and ruthless operators like Marat Balagula and Vladimir Reznikov. Standing at the crossroads of this transition was Anthony Gaspipe Casso, the notoriously violent underboss of the Lucchese crime family, whose decisions would mark a bloody turning point in Mafia-Russian relations. At the forefront was Marat Balagula, a Ukrainian-born Jewish migrant who combined white-collar intelligence with underworld cunning. Balagula ran an international criminal empire centered on gasoline tax fraud, which involved selling untaxed gas through a maze of shell companies, a scheme that generated hundreds of millions of dollars, much of it laundered through banks and businesses. Balagula was no street thug. He was described as the Russian Rockefeller. But as his profits grew and his influence extended into traditional mafia rackets, he inevitably caught the attention of the five families, especially the Lucchese family. His success also attracted the attention of another Russian, Vladimir Reznikov. The feud began when Reznikov, in a brazen act of aggression, drove to Balagula's office building in the Midwood section of Brooklyn and opened fire with an AK-47. The attack resulted in the death of one of Balagula's close associates and left several office staff wounded. This act of violence marked a serious escalation in their rivalry and signaled Reznikov's willingness to go to extreme lengths to assert control. The situation intensified on June 12, 1986, when Reznikov confronted Balagula at the Rasputin nightclub in Brighton Beach. Armed with a 9mm Beretta, Reznikov held the gun to Balagula's head and demanded $600,000 in exchange for sparing his life. He further demanded a share of all of Balagula's operations. After Balagula promised to get the money, Reznikov threatened his family before departing. The stress of the encounter caused Balagula to suffer a massive heart attack. Believing he would be safer at home, he insisted on being treated there rather than at a hospital. Faced with a direct threat to his life and business, Balagula turned to Anthony Casso, a feared enforcer for the Lucchese crime family. Upon hearing the details of Reznikov's threats, Casso was incensed. He reportedly told Balagula that Reznikov had not just threatened him, but insulted the entire Cosa Nostra. In response, Casso devised a plan. He told Balagula to inform Reznikov that the money would be ready the next day at the same nightclub. Casso assured him, "We'll take care of the rest." Balagula, clearly shaken, expressed concern over Reznikov's violent nature. But Casso remained confident and requested a photograph and description of Reznikov's car to aid in the plan. Casso and his associate, Victor Amuzzo, secured approval from their superior, Lucchese underboss Christopher Fernari, to carry out the hit. On June 13, 1986, Reznikov returned to the nightclub, expecting to collect his money. When he realized Balagula wasn't there, he stormed down to the parking lot, where Joseph Testa, a veteran of the DeMeo crew, shot him 6 times in the arm, leg, and hip. As Reznikov attempted to draw his weapon, Testa delivered a fatal 7th shot to the head. Testa then fled in a car driven by Anthony Center, another DeMeo crew member. According to Casso, The hit ensured Balagula faced no further issues from other Russian gangsters. The murder of Reznikov sent a clear message. Threats against those under Mafia protection would not be tolerated. As Casso later remarked, after that, Marat didn't have any problems with other Russians. The swift and lethal resolution of the conflict underscored the brutal efficiency with which the Mafia maintained order, not just within its own ranks, but among other criminal enterprises operating within its sphere of influence. The murder remained unsolved until 1994, when Casso, after becoming an informant following his 1993 arrest, revealed details of the killing. He confirmed that Testa and Center, known as the Gemini twins, carried out the hit under his orders, with permission from Lucchese consigliere Christopher Fornari. Casso's cooperation exposed the Lucchese family's involvement, though Testa was never charged with Reznikov's murder and was already in federal prison for other crimes by the time of Casso's testimony. The Mafia and the Russians, a fragile balance. Casso's killing of Reznikov did not ignite a larger war with the Russian mob. In fact, it seemed to establish a kind of understanding. After the Reznikov incident, there were fewer overt conflicts between the Lucchese family and Russian gangsters, at least during Casso's tenure. Some Russian figures even began cooperating with traditional Mafia families in certain financial scams, such as gas tax fraud and credit card operations. But the relationship remained tense and transactional, never built on the old-world respect that governed intra-Mafia dealings. For the Italian-American mob, the rise of the Russians represented a new kind of threat, one that couldn't be resolved with sit-downs or appeals to tradition. The Russians were unbound by the rules of La Cosa Nostra, and their operations, often involving cybercrime, international fraud, and human trafficking, were unlike anything the five families had seen before. Casso understood this implicitly, which is why his approach was blunt. Act fast, act violently, and reassert control before chaos could spread. In the end, Casso's dealings with the Russian mob were emblematic of his entire criminal career. Ruthless, direct, and violently effective. But they also foreshadowed the decline of traditional Mafia dominance as newer, globalized criminal enterprises began rewriting the rules of organized crime in America. The downfall of Anthony Gaspipe Casso, the end of a Mafia terror. As underboss of the Lucchese family during the 1980s and early 90s, Casso orchestrated murders, corruption schemes, and multi-million-dollar rackets with terrifying efficiency. He operated in a world ruled by loyalty, secrecy, and violence, and he thrived in it. But like many Mafia powerhouses, Casso's reign would ultimately collapse under the weight of paranoia, betrayal, and relentless federal pressure. His downfall, dramatic and complex, mirrored the larger unraveling of the American Mafia in the late 20th century. A reign of terror. By the late 80s, Anthony Casso had cemented himself as the enforcer and strategic mastermind behind the Lucchese family. Alongside boss Vittorio Vic Amuso, he imposed a reign of terror over both enemies and allies, ordering hits on rivals, suspected informants, and even fellow Lucchese members. His use of corrupt NYPD detectives Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa to carry out murders marked one of the darkest chapters in organized crime history, and gave him an edge that no other mobster had. However, Casso's methods, while effective, bred intense paranoia. He saw betrayal everywhere. As the FBI's pursuit of the Mafia intensified following the success of the RICO Act, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, Casso became increasingly erratic, sanctioning murders at the slightest sign of disloyalty. Trust among Mafia ranks began to erode. The Lucchese collapse, on the run. In 1990, as federal indictments loomed, Casso and Amuzzo fled New York, going into hiding to avoid prosecution. They remained fugitives for nearly 3 years, during which time Casso still attempted to manage the family affairs from the shadows, issuing orders and communicating through loyal intermediaries. But his time on the run was marred by internal decay. The Lucchese family, under the leadership of fugitive bosses, began to fracture. Casso, increasingly reliant on a shrinking circle of loyalists, watched as more of his associates turned government informants. Capture and turning informant. On January 19, 1993, Casso's time as a fugitive ended. He was arrested by the FBI in Mount Olive, New Jersey, in the home of his mistress, after being betrayed by a close associate. He faced charges including multiple counts of murder, racketeering, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Initially, Casso vowed to fight the charges. But by 1994, sensing that the government's case was airtight, bolstered by informants, surveillance, and years of investigative work, Casso made a shocking decision. He agreed to become a government witness. For a man of Casso's stature, an underboss with a reputation for ruthlessness, the decision to flip was seismic. He was, at the time, one of the highest-ranking mafiosi to turn informant. His cooperation offered the potential to dismantle the Lucchese family from the inside and expose criminal activity across multiple families. Casso confessed to involvement in at least 36 murders and gave investigators details about the Mafia Cops, murder plots, and corruption within law enforcement. The fallout of cooperation. At first, Casso's cooperation was welcomed by federal prosecutors, but problems quickly surfaced. Casso was manipulative, arrogant, and unrepentant. He attempted to maintain control from behind bars and was caught lying to investigators, withholding information, and even trying to corrupt the Witness Protection Program. By 1997, the U.S. Department of Justice dropped him as a cooperating witness, an almost unprecedented move. Officials stated that Casso was untrustworthy and incapable of being managed. His testimony was deemed unreliable, and his opportunity to reduce his sentence vanished. Prison and death. In 1998, Anthony Casso was sentenced to 455 years in prison for racketeering, extortion, conspiracy, and murder. He was incarcerated in the federal Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, one of the most secure facilities in the U.S. Despite his early cooperation, he spent the rest of his life in harsh isolation, having betrayed the very code he had once killed to uphold. Casso died on December 15, 2020, at the age of 78 after contracting COVID-19 while in federal custody. He died alone, abandoned by the mafia, rejected by the government, and remembered largely for the trail of violence he left behind. A legacy of blood and betrayal. The downfall of Anthony Gaspipe Casso is a cautionary tale of power corrupted and loyalty undone. His rise through the mafia ranks was marked by cold efficiency and violent dominance. But his fall exposed the frailty of the underworld's codes when faced with modern law enforcement pressure. In the end, Casso destroyed everything he once ruled. His paranoia drove internal division, his cooperation backfired, and his brutality alienated even his allies. While he was once feared as one of the most dangerous mobsters in America, his legacy is ultimately one of self-destruction, a kingpin undone by his own hand. Like so many involved in murder and other savagery in the mob, he failed to make it out alive. All right, folks, that was a good one. We're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thanks for following along this week. Remember, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, hit us up at info@gearconvoy.com or stop by gearconvoy.com, the website, to check out what we got going on. And don't forget to select the MOA tab for more information about the broadcast. Remember, if you wait to prepare, it may be too late. If you don't make it out alive, you don't make it out at all. Stay safe out there, folks.